So, hi everyone, welcome to this talk about Knative. We will do this a bit differently today. Imagine for a second we are in this mythical forest, and what I'm going to tell you will be in the form of a fairy tale. I hope you will find some parallels to the real world and maybe recognize yourself in that. Shortly about me, who am I? I'm Reto. I work at Red Hat on the Knative project, mostly upstream, so in the open source part. And in this fairy tale, I will guide you being the wizard of Knative. And we will have some more help here. So let me introduce the developer knight. Imagine he does his day-to-day work. He's a developer, he knows his stuff, but he cares about, he's passionate about, and he works on that, and that's his thing in this whole universe. But then one day, the Almighty King summons him to his castle and tells him that the princess has been away for a long time. They can't find her. And the developer knight has now the job to get the princess, and he can then have whatever he wants. So, developer knight, he knows his day-to-day job, so first thing he does is he goes out and watches at the landscape. Where do I want to go? What do I need to do? He packs his stuff. He puts his code into bags and packs it up, packs it on his horse, and tries to go that way. So first steps work fine. He can manage. He gets along. But then suddenly he stands at the forest of YAML. And that thing is impenetrable. He cannot get through that. So the developer knight asks himself, what can I do? How can I get past this? All these YAML thingies that I need to take care of. That's way too much. What happens in a good fairy tale? The fairy appears, obviously the Knative fairy, and tells him, hey, doesn't matter. You can use Knative for this. You just have to know one YAML, and the rest is magic. Let me show that to you. So here you can see the Knative YAML in a minimal form. So we only have to define a namespace, a name, and what horse we want, right? We have packed this thing, it's ready, it can be shipped. So yeah, let's do that. I will apply directly from here to the terminal below here, so you can see the output down here. We will use that again. And now that's it. All the YAML stuff is taken care of. Let's see that. So behind the scenes, the Knative magic does this transformation here, right, to all these other YAMLs that you need. So if we take a look, we have a deployment here somehow that came, and it's quite large. It actually has lots of stuff in it, also health checks and stuff, and it's way longer, even longer. And down at the bottom here, we also have a service. Obviously, you all have played with Kubernetes, so you know that we have even more objects that are necessary to run, right? So let's see here the whole tree of that Knative service. So I will display here what resources were created based on that one service. You have the one service on top. Then we have some YAML files that are Knative internal, but we also have some things that should be familiar to native Kubernetes users, like deployments, replica sets. We have endpoint services, and we also have some kind of routing in place here. So Knative magic takes care of managing all that for you, and you don't have to care about these YAML files. So what else can we do? We have a client as well for Knative. It's called KN, because K was already taken for most people by the kubectl. And we can list services here. Obviously, it can do the same thing with kubectl as well. So K is kubectl for those who don't have that alias in place. So I can also get it using the native commands. And here we can see I have an URL. So let's see what that is. Let's click it. That's our horse that we packed. It's our it will be with us on our journey here. So as you can see, that tab here, Knative took care of that whole forest of YAML of us, and we get past it, so we can now continue the journey. We get past the forest, and on the other end, we see these mountains in front of us. We have a nice sun coming up, so it's really mythical, and the developer knight is really motivated to go along and to save the princess. So we're on our way now with our horse, riding along, and at some point, we stumble upon this bridge. And yeah, obviously we have to pass it because it's the only way forward here. Then the finance dragon, the finance dragon shows up and tells us that we are spending too much resources. We cannot pass if we use that much resources. So the developer knight again has to figure out a solution here, and obviously the fairy again. Knative can help with that. You don't have to take care of that. So for now, we're still using that horse, right? So let's get back to the demo here. We want to pass the bridge now. Now we need a bit more terminals here. So the first thing that we do is we are going to watch the pods that are actually running in our namespace. We can see the horse is using resources here. No, I don't want to delete that. I want to copy it. And we also watch a custom object of Knative that is called pod autoscaler, where we can see what Knative is actually calculating in terms of scaling behind the scenes. So as you can see, for now, we have one instance running. It's ready, healthy, and we also have a container here. That's obviously true, right? We're still using the horse. So let's stop using the horse. So we now don't use the horse anymore. And we just wait for a bit and see what happens. And behind the scenes, the default of Knative is actually to scale to 0 if you don't use your application, your horse. So you can now see it, it's already terminating state. So the container will now wait if more requests come in and handle the shutdown gracefully. You don't have to take care of that in your application. And if that's done, we won't use any resources any longer. It's still terminating. It will take a while, but I'm now using the horse again. I'm doing this time here in the terminal. And as you can see, we immediately get spawned the horse again and can use it as we have before. So I can also, again, open this, and we still have the horse here. So per default, Knative will actually scale initially the horse. So it will first start your application and make sure everything works correctly, and then see if there are any requests. And if there are none, scale to 0, scale up again if requests occur. But to pass that bridge, we want to initially not scale, right? We want the horse not to be there, then pass the bridge. And if we pass the bridge, we want to get back the horse. So we can do this with annotations. So everything Knative can do has defaults that are opinionated, but you can obviously override and configure if you want to change them. So we will now scale initially to 0. In the autoscaler, you can see down here on the right, we have -1 as the desired scale. That just means the user said don't scale at all. Don't ask me why it's not 0, it's -1, because it's a defined state. And we can now pass the bridge. And obviously on the other side, again, use the horse. Horse comes back to us. And we're up and running again. So I promised that we also do some behind the scenes, right? So here is an architecture picture of the stuff behind. We are actually using in Knative an ingress gateway. That can be one that we bring ourselves, or there's also integrations with Contour or Courier and Istio. And that one actually calls either the actual applications container, or if that's scaled to 0, the requests need to go somewhere, right? Otherwise, we will get 503 or whatever, or errors. So we then go in proxy mode to the activator. That's a component of Knative that will take care of caching and buffering your request. So your caller calls, that thing buffers the request, tells the autoscaler, hey, there is a request coming in, please get back your app or your horse. And as soon as that is up and ready and healthy, it will forward the request without the client noticing. So the first call will actually be a bit slower, depending on if we need to get the image or other stuff, or if your application takes a long time to start. We heard this morning that there might be some future cool improvements there that we could maybe leverage to make it even faster. But that's what people usually refer to as cold start in serverless environments. There are some tweaks that we can do, like we can pre-pull images that they are already on the node that we target, and then startup will be pretty fast. As you can see on my machine here, images are already there, so it's actually pretty fast. So time-wise, I can't tell you anything. We can do on this serving part even more. For example, we can also buffer requests when applications are overloaded. So an application can define how many requests can it handle per second or concurrently, and Knative will make sure that you never receive more than that. We can also do some fancy traffic routing, A/B deployments, canary rollouts for vanilla Kubernetes, as this is not in the core Kubernetes, contained in the core Kubernetes. We can have kind of like a target that we have a fixed rate per application and stuff like that. Furthermore, we have this configuration thingy where you can roll back to an old state, so your configuration is actually versioned, and every time you change it, you will get a new version and can roll back to the old one. And that's not just for the image, but it's for the whole configuration example. We will see that later on as well. And obviously, we also have some metrics and observability. As we have some control over the deployed application, we can tag in and add stuff like other software like Service Mesh would do as well. So back to the presentation. Developer Knight and his horse now passed the bridge. We came across that and we can continue our journey. And obviously, the next thing happens. We come to this door in the middle of the forest, because it's a fairy tale. And the policy ogre occurs. And the policy ogre actually tells us that by policy, we now have to be Kafka capable, because that's the new management policy. So we need to speak Kafka, otherwise we are not allowed to pass. Again, we need a solution. Obviously, Developer Knight asks himself, what is a Kafka? What do I do with that? I don't care. I don't know. It's not my thing. I want to save the princess. Knative fairy again. We can help with that. Let's show that in a demo again. So here I will start with the architecture first and then show the demo to make it a bit more clear. So on the left-hand side, we have our horse. And what you don't see is the right part. So we have this ogre. The ogre is already up and running, and the ogre obviously knows Kafka, and he can talk to Kafka. And what Knative brings here is we have an abstraction that enables to integrate with event sources, various event sources, using something called cloud events. So cloud events is an upstream specification of lightweight events over HTTP. So it's a defined spec that you have to fulfill, and then you can talk to this thing using HTTP only. So on the side of our horse, we only need to manage HTTP. We need the ability to receive and handle HTTP posts. And if we want to send something, we do the same thing. We send HTTP post again. And the Knative bits here are in blue. We actually have implementations for various event sources that then translate that to the protocol that is specific to the event broker. Here in that case, it would be Kafka. So the horse actually has no idea about Kafka. It can be switched to anything else. It's bridging these events here. That's the architecture. How does that look like? Let's take a look at the source code of the horse. It's a Go app here. and we can see it has no dependencies. So first thing here, it's just plain Go. Second thing here is we do HTTP with Go's native from the language. So we can actually handle on root path files. So that's how the picture got back, right? We have this application there. But it also contains already endpoints for knocking on that door and then also receiving cloud events. There are some more to make it work, but in general, it's pretty easy. So knock on door is just issuing a new HTTP post here to some broker. And we're sending just a string here, knock on door for now. And you can see here, that's part of the cloud events. So cloud events defines something like header, or not something, it's a HTTP header, but it defines headers with a certain format that has a version of the spec in it and IDs of sender and a type and a source and stuff like that. And as long as you can send requests in that format to that endpoint, it will work. So here you can see the horse actually does not know anything about Kafka or topics or partitions or whatever. It just sends a HTTP request with the correct headers. Obviously, typically you wouldn't do that, right? The Ogre is also a Go app, but here, just to show that, there is also a Cloud Events SDK. And with the Cloud Events SDK, you have a typed version of that whole thing where you can create events and send events and receive events without doing the raw HTTP stuff yourself. That may be just for a reference if you want to look that code up later again. So sending, knocking on the door, just HTTP post. We send client 2 here, that's it. And the other way around, receiving cloud event is actually bound to /cloud events. So something will call us on that URL and send us something. Here we just, it's pretty basic, makes not a lot of sense. We just parse whatever is in the body and put it in a variable here, and that variable we will get back to the front end. So in the real world, you typically would have defined event payloads depending on the source maybe, and you know what to expect and how to parse and read this. Here we just do strings, so we can put in and out anything we want. But that's just for the sake of easiness. Okay, so let's see how that works in action. That's what I just for reference, for later reference, here you have the whole description again. What we now need is, if we think back to the architecture document here, we already have the horse, right? That's already there, but we need a trigger, and we need to define a trigger so that Knative can call us if some event is happening. The trigger, again, is a custom resource. It looks like this. So we can name it, store events in what namespace, and we can also define a filter. Maybe I don't want anything that is in the whole Kafka thing and what's happening there, so I want something specific. I want to receive door events, and if I receive them, please send them to. And here we can have a reference, and anything that can receive HTTP requests can be in here. So here it's a Knative service. It can also be a Kubernetes service, so we can also use the API of a normal Kubernetes service or whatever. So you can, as long as you can receive HTTP, it doesn't have to be a Knative endpoint. It just has to be a web server somehow that I can reach. And we can also specify a URI to call. So Knative will actually take the Kafka event, change it to cloud events, forward it using HTTP post to our endpoints. So let's apply that trigger. Voila, that's created. Then I can also get the trigger, obviously, and see if it's ready and healthy. Ready means I will get forwarded stuff. And there is one thing left that I omitted before. To send, we also need to know where the broker is. So we actually can use the kgetBroker here to get the URL of the broker that is in that cluster. And if I want to send something to Kafka, I have to HTTP post to that URL here. Our application needs to know that, right? So we now here add an environment variable to our service where we specify that URL so that it knows where to send stuff. So let's do that as well. And we can now see on the right-hand side that this again leads to the application being recreated and with a new configuration, rollout stuff, everything you already know from Kubernetes. So for the demo, it's actually fun to watch what's happening inside the system, right? So on the top right here, we will watch the logs of the Ogre, and this side here we will do after the demo to see what happens there. If I go back now to my Kafka-capable horse here, I can see the UI changed because it's now Kafka-capable, and I can knock on the door. And if I knock on the door, that was pretty fast, I got back the response from the Ogre because I now can talk Kafka. The door is open, and I can pass. So let's quickly see here the logs again. So the top one is the Ogre. That just logs that he got an event with the spec version type, so that should be familiar from the code example. That's what we sent. And down here we can see that we sent knocking on the door to that broker URL. We received 202 back, so that it has been accepted and sent to Kafka. And then we get the request body back, so we get that event back from the Ogre, and we send the door state back. That's kind of for the front end to make visible. So also here, I cannot show you all the features. So Knative eventing is based on cloud events. I said that already. It's also an event mesh. So there is functionality in there to kind of route events more complex than what I just showed. We have multiple brokers. We can use the triggers to map them to services. We have other sinks. We have other sources. So there is a whole lot of custom resources that allow even more configurability and to control the event delivery, have some retries when stuff fails and dead letter queues, and all that stuff is in there as well. And obviously also metrics and observability. We cannot get into too much detail there. So let's get back to the slides here again. We now passed the door, and behind that we find the enchanted garden, and there we actually find the princess. She was held there by a spell, and we were able to get to her. That breaks the spell, and we can get back to the castle. We now have our horse and the princess we get back. To quickly summarize, so we did this journey. We already knew how to build stuff and to package it. We learned how to easily deploy it without knowing too much about all this YAML stuff. We passed the finance dragon using scale to 0 because we are not consuming any resources during the time when we crossed the bridge. And with the Ogre door, we opened that by talking to Kafka without actually knowing Kafka. And we saved the princess. So back to the king. He's very happy. He has his princess back and asks us, you can have anything you want. You're the developer knight. What do you want? What do developers want? Obviously, land, money. Pizza, maybe beer, also not maybe too early. Obviously, they want this. So, yeah, that was it. Thanks for your attention, folks, and questions.
I heard the first row is really eager in asking questions. Back there is a mic in front in the plant. Maybe you can grab this one in the pot. Thank you.
So just maybe a little provocation. So the developer didn't have to learn Kafka, but he still needs to learn cloud events or whatever it is. So in the end, you're just abstracting a bit, but you still need to. The developer really doesn't want to know any of that, right? So because you still have to have a spec. The developer is going to ask, how do I have this spec? How do I do it? And so on and so forth. While I just want to do some calls and so on and so forth. I don't know if this makes any sense or not.
It does. There wasn't a question, I think, but yeah, just my personal opinion there. So Yeah, obviously we need to have some kind of common understanding, right? Otherwise it's hard. You cannot just send stuff in any form, and the magic, there is no magic, right? But HTTP should be a pretty common denominator for developers, right? It doesn't matter what language you have, you typically can do HTTP post. And if I remember back to some customers where we had exactly that kind of policy, it didn't make sense. Kafka didn't make sense, but we had to. And then it's easier to tell them, hey, here is the spec for the HTTP headers, send it that way, fine. Or even go with the SDK and that takes care of it, right? And if the new policy comes along and it says, hey, we now use whatever, RabbitMQ, whatever, you can change the broker and the rest stays the same. Maybe that's not a real world example, but yeah, HTTP should be pretty a good common ground, I think. You obviously can still use Kafka directly if you want.
Thank you. You talked about all the advantages of Knative, but I'm wondering, is that just a fairy tale? Are there any downsides to it, or are there cases where Knative doesn't make sense?
Yes, that's a good question. Obviously, it's not a fairy tale, and each tech product has its bases where it makes sense and others where it does not, right? So as you seen, it's scaling on requests. If you don't have HTTP requests coming in, yeah, it's pretty hard to scale, right? Then you might be better for batch workloads or something like that to go with jobs or batching frameworks or stuff like that. It's really good for adaptive workloads to adaptive requests coming in. Also in cloud environments where we really can scale down also the worker nodes and save money in the end. So if you have fixed amount of servers and it doesn't matter if stuff runs or not, maybe it's a business app that has one container running, I don't know, then it's overhead. Maybe the overhead here for the developer, it gets easier, but the platform team has to maintain one more layer on top, right? You have seen there are many custom resources. You need to make yourself familiar with those and so on. So it really depends on your use case, as always with tech stuff.
So my question is, it seems almost like this should be baked into Kubernetes, right? So this is an extra layer on top to solve another problem. Why isn't this just somehow added to the next version of Kubernetes?
It's kind of, so in the beginning there was the same discussion about ingress, right? Having a native implementation of ingress in Kubernetes. And folks in the end couldn't agree on what's the best way to do it, right? So they just defined an API and let the implementation be defined by different vendors, different companies, different ideas. I think Kelsey Hightower at some point said, it's kind of like if Kubernetes is the power grid, then Knative would be the light switch or something like that. So it complements it very good, but it doesn't solve all the problems or it's very opinionated and most people maybe have that then and don't use it. So parts of that make sense. We also are trying to get some stuff of it back to upstream Kubernetes, but it's hard to do, right? There's lots of companies, lots of opinions, lots of politics.
Other questions? Then it's time for a round of applause. Thank you, Reto. There will be now...